Okay, let's jump right into the deep end. We are attempting to synthesize one of the most complex, contradictory, and just expansive literary careers of the 20th century,
Yeah.
that of Doris Lessing.
Right.
And this isn't just a biography. I think we have to see this as more of an intellectual expedition. We're following an author who was constantly changing her political, her spiritual, and even her literary zip codes.
It's a truly fascinating assignment because Lessing, she just refused to be one thing, ever.
Right.
You know, you say she's a British novelist, and yes, that's true, but she was born in Kermanshah, in Persia.
A long way from London.
A very long way. And she spent all her formative years navigating the isolation, the racial tensions of a colonial farm in what was then Southern Rhodesia.
Only to completely resurface in London as, what, a radical communist?
A radical communist, then
Yeah.
a pioneer of psychological realism in the novel, and then, and this is the part that threw everyone, she ends her career as an epicist, writing what she called space fiction.
That journey from a colonial maize farm to interstellar societies is precisely why we need to do this. It's why we have to dedicate a thorough deep dive into the sources on her life.
And of course, the capstone to this whole incredible career was the 2007 Nobel Prize in Literature.
At 87 years old.
87. She was the oldest person ever to receive that particular prize at the time.
Which, I mean, that in itself says something about the sheer endurance and scope of her work, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the Nobel citation itself is the perfect mission statement for our discussion today.
What did they say exactly?
The Swedish Academy called her an epicist of the female experience who, with skepticism, fire, and visionary power, has subjected a divided civilization to scrutiny.
A divided civilization. That phrase is everything.
It's the constant theme. It doesn't matter if she was scrutinizing apartheid in Rhodesia in the 40s or, some kind of galactic bureaucracy in the cosmos in the 80s. It's always about the divided civilization.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The material we have on Lessing, it doesn't paint a picture of one single consistent writer.
Not at all.
It's more like 3, maybe even 4 really distinct literary personalities that evolved across these totally different political and spiritual frameworks.
So our goal here is to trace the radical life choices that drove those shifts. We have to go from her really fraught colonial upbringing and her subsequent radical politics.
Right, through that psychological phase of her most famous work.
And then finally land in her deep immersion in mystical traditions like Sufism.
We'll start by following the geography, right?
Yeah.
The geographical and political movements that really defined her early years, because those initial displacements, they created the raw material for all of her realism.
And then from there, we can move into the major thematic shifts in her writing.
So the abandonment of political dogma for something more internal.
Exactly, for internal psychological truth. And then finally, that eventual cosmic exploration that really defined her late career.
It's a journey that starts a very, very long way from the London literary salons. To really understand the intensity of Doris Lessing's drive, her need to constantly break away, we have to start not just with her birth, but with the specific, highly charged environment of her parents.
Right. She was born Doris May Taylor in Kermanshah, Persia, on October 20th, 1919.
And her father, Captain Alfred Taylor, he was a World War I veteran.
A severely injured one. He lost a leg in the war, and he actually met her mother, Emily Maud McVeigh, who was a nurse, while he was recovering at the Royal Free Hospital in London.
So that parental backstory is already, it's just fundamental to the psychological tension that Lessing would explore in her work for decades.
Absolutely. Her father, he's seeking a fresh start. He's been through this incredible trauma, and he's lured by the promise of a new life, a colonial life. He takes a job as a clerk for the Imperial Bank of Persia.
Which is why she was born there.
Exactly. But it was the next move, the big move in 1925, that truly defined her perspective. It provided the setting for her entire first literary phase.
And that move was to the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, which is now, of course, Zimbabwe.
Right. They were going to farm maize, other crops on this huge 1,000-acre plot of land that Alfred had bought.
And the sources, they really highlight a crucial contrast here, a clash between the dream and the reality that would just deeply, deeply influence the young Doris.
Precisely. You have her father, the injured war hero, chasing this sort of romanticized colonial agricultural dream.
A New Eden?
Kind of. But then you have her mother, Emily, who was carrying all the baggage of an aspirational, sophisticated Edwardian lifestyle. She expected culture. She expected social standing, refinement.
And she gets a dusty farm instead.
She gets a dusty farm that was delivering, and this is, quote, very little income. So these highbrow expectations just utterly clashed with the rough, isolated reality of the bush.
You can just imagine it.
Lessing was raised right in the crucible of that aspirational failure. There was this constant tension between the romanticized promises of the British Empire and the just grinding, poor reality of their life.
And that economic reality, it seems to have directly curtailed her formal schooling.
Oh, for sure. She attended the Dominican convent high school and then just 1 year at the girls' high school in Salisbury.
And then she was done at age 13.
Left school entirely at 13. And that decision to leave formal education so early, it's absolutely key to her development as this fiercely independent thinker.
Because it meant she escaped the system.
It meant she escaped the rigidity of the colonial social structures and also her mother's frustrated Edwardian ambitions. She had to become self-educated, She had to chart her own intellectual course.
Which set the precedent for her entire life, really. A lifelong rejection of established authority.
And she exercised that independence very early. At 15, she just left the farm, left her parents to go work as a nursemaid.
And this isn't just a biographical detail, is it? This is a real turning point.
It was everything, because it was while working for this family that she was exposed to completely new ideas. Her employer gave her reading material on politics and sociology.
And that was it.
That was the moment her intellectual and literary path really began.
So her early adult life in Salisbury, it seems characterized by this rapid succession of decisions that all prioritized her own intellectual development over any kind of domestic stability.
100%. She had 2 early marriages. The first was to Frank Wisdom from 1939 to 1943. They had 2 children, John and Jean.
And then almost immediately after, she married again.
Right, to Gottfried Anton Nikolai Lessing from 1943 to 1949. And they had 1 son, Peter.
And here is where we hit one of the most controversial and I think one of the most illuminating decisions of her entire life. It reveals her absolute, almost ruthless commitment to her own professional and political identity.
The move to London.
The move to London in 1949. When she divorced Gottfried to pursue her writing and her socialist politics, she only took her youngest son, Peter, with her.
Leaving the 2 older children, John and Jean, with their father, Frank Wisdom, back in Southern Rhodesia.
This choice, it caused a huge amount of public scrutiny throughout her life, especially after she became famous. But the source material gives us her raw, unfiltered rationale later in life, and it is brutally honest about her priorities.
It really forces you to pause and re-examine all the traditional ideas of maternal sacrifice.
She said, and this is a direct quote, "For a long time I felt I had done a very brave thing. There is nothing more boring for an intelligent woman than to spend endless amounts of time with small children."
Can you imagine saying that publicly today, let alone back then? It's an articulation of a choice that many women felt but couldn't or wouldn't dare to express.
She elaborated on it, too. She said she felt she wasn't the right person to raise them.
And crucially, she believed that if she had stayed in that confining domestic role, she would have ended up an alcoholic or a frustrated intellectual like my mother.
That connection back to her mother is critical, isn't it?
It's everything. She saw the outcome. She saw what happened to a talented, intelligent woman who was constrained by marriage and colonial society, and she decided she had to make a radical, some would say selfish, break for her own intellectual survival.
So you have to ask, as a reader, was that decision just pragmatic, a kind of intellectual necessity, or was it also a form of radical emotional avoidance?
I think it was probably both. It was pragmatic for sure. It freed her to move to London to join the intellectual circles that launched her career.
But it was also radical because she was essentially placing her own self-actualization above the supreme social expectation of motherhood.
Exactly. She recognized that her particular genius required a massive amount of uninterrupted focus and intellectual stimulation. The Southern Rhodesian environment could not provide that.
So this decision, it perfectly encapsulates her lifelong refusal to be pigeonholed.
First as a colonial farmer's daughter and now as a traditional mother. She demanded intellectual freedom above everything else. Yeah. And that drive, it led her immediately into her next major phase, political activism and literary realism.
So that radical break in 1949 was really fueled by this political awakening that had already taken hold back in Southern Rhodesia.
Right, and this launched what we call her communist phase, which was also her first great phase of literary realism.
Her political journey seems deeply intertwined with her second marriage.
It was. She met Gottfried Lessing, who was a German Jewish communist refugee, through the local community built around the Left Book Club in Salisbury. She had joined that back in 1942.
And that must have been like water in the desert for her.
Oh, absolutely. It provided the intellectual structure, the community, the debate that she had been starving for out on the farm.
And she quickly became more than just a member, didn't she? She was an active and very outspoken voice.
Very. She developed this strong, unwavering opposition to apartheid in South Africa and also to the burgeoning nuclear arms race. And this activism had very real, tangible consequences for her.
Yeah, in 1956, she was officially banned from both South Africa and Southern Rhodesia.
A ban that lasted for many, many years. She was publicly recognized by the colonial regimes as a major political agitator. So this wasn't just, theoretical armchair activism.
No, this was real-world dissent that literally shut her out of the entire geographical region that had defined her youth.
And the sources reveal that her political profile was even higher than we might assume for a novelist in waiting. It was confirmed in 2015 that Lessing was under intense surveillance by British intelligence agencies.
Which is just a fascinating detail.
It's incredible. A 5-volume secret file on her, compiled by both MI5 and MI6, was made public.
MI5 and MI6.
Both. And this surveillance began way back in the early 1940s and continued for 2 decades. It focused specifically on her associations with communist organizations and her political activities, both in Africa and later in the UK.
So what does that tell you? It tells you she wasn't just casually attending a few meetings.
Not at all. She was viewed as a genuine threat, or at the very least a person of significant interest to the state security apparatus. She was already defying the establishment before she'd even published her biggest literary hits.
The establishment was watching the activist even before the literary world was celebrating the author.
Exactly. And meanwhile, when she arrives in London in 1949, her fiction career just explodes, almost immediately. It demonstrates the immense creative energy she had unleashed by shedding all those earlier constraints.
Her first novel, The Grass is Singing, published in 1950. It's a landmark work of colonial literature set entirely in Southern Rhodesia. We have to pause here and just look at this novel because it really set the tone for all of her early realism.
It's a devastating book, a psychological study of racial and sexual anxiety in that colonial environment. It tells the story of Mary Turner, a white woman who's trapped in a loveless marriage on a failing farm.
Sounds familiar.
Very. And she finds herself unable to cope with the isolation and the strict racial codes of the time. The whole narrative is driven by her growing psychological decline and her really unsettling, complex relationship with her black servant, Moses.
The power of that novel, it lies in its unflinching focus on the white psyche disintegrating under the pressures of maintaining that colonial structure.
It's not just a critique of apartheid from the outside. It's a deep dive into how colonialism warps and destroys the colonizers themselves, often leaving them incapable of basic human connection or even survival.
And that focus on Southern Rhodesia continued through her early short fiction, right? The stories collected in African stories.
Yes, all those works capture the atmosphere of the country, the heat, the poverty, the social stagnation, with just this unflinching, brutal clarity. This was her phase of political and geographic specificity.
However, this rigorous political alignment, the whole communist phase, it didn't last.
No. Again, Lessing demonstrated that she was intellectually nomadic. She couldn't stay in one place.
The year 1956 seems to have been the major turning point for her politics, just as 1949 was for her personal life.
That's the year she left the Communist Party of Great Britain. And she did so following the brutal Soviet suppression of the Hungarian Revolution.
Which was a classic ideological rupture for so many Western intellectuals who had clung to that Soviet idealism.
It was. And for Lessing, it was the moment where the rigid doctrine she had embraced just failed the test of human reality and historical truth. It broke.
And that skepticism, it stuck with her. She continued to call out Soviet abuses, voicing strong opposition to actions like the invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s.
So she wasn't just shifting from one political camp to another. She was developing this overarching skepticism towards any rigid political structure or dogma.
And that intellectual transition from the political exterior to the spiritual interior is so critical.
The sources note that once she turned away from Marxist political philosophy, she became, and I'm quoting, increasingly absorbed with mystical and spiritual matters, specifically focusing on the Sufi tradition.
She needed a new framework.
A new framework for understanding the chaos of the divided civilization. And this sets the stage perfectly for her most celebrated and also her most controversial works. This transition leads us directly into what is often called her psychological phase. It spans roughly from 1956 to 1969.
And this period is just dominated by two massive literary achievements. You have the 5 novels in the Children of Violence series, and then the one single work that brought her global watershed attention.
The Golden Notebook.
But before we jump into the Golden Notebook, we really need to give due time to Children of Violence because it truly chronicles that ideological and geographic journey we've been describing.
Oh, absolutely. It follows the life of Martha Quest from her youth on a Southern Rhodesian farm through her political awakening in the city, her moves to London, and her ongoing intellectual and psychological search for meaning.
It's a huge series.
It is. The Martha Quest series, it's Martha Quest, then A Proper Marriage, A Ripple from the Storm, Landlocked, and finally The Four-Gated City in '69. It is essentially her own psychopolitical autobiography rendered as fiction.
So Martha is searching for a meaningful way to live. She's rejecting the societal constraints of colonial life, of marriage, and eventually the limitations of communism itself.
The theme throughout is the individual's struggle against the overwhelming, often violent pressures of society. Martha's quest is to find self-definition in a world that is constantly trying to impose definitions upon her.
It's an epic undertaking. It shows the development of her consciousness from a sort of dreamy adolescent in the colonies to a deeply skeptical adult in a fragmented modern world.
But the work that broke the mold, the one that became an international phenomenon, was The Golden Notebook, published in 1962. It's undeniably a masterpiece of modern literary structure.
And as the sources all confirm, it's considered a feminist classic by so many scholars and cultural commentators.
Which brings us to that major, fascinating point of contention. Lessing's staunch, even aggressive, rejection of the feminist label.
It raises such an important question. When a piece of art has a revolutionary cultural impact, does the author's original intent still matter?
Lessing would argue definitively yes. Yes, it does. She felt critics were just reducing the complexity of her work to a simple political agenda.
And she said this repeatedly.
Over and over. She said that critics overlooked the novel's true main theme, which was mental breakdown as a necessary means of healing and freeing oneself from false assumptions, from illusions. It was an exploration of fragmentation and the search for wholeness.
And this search for wholeness is where the, quote, exceptional structure she mentioned comes in.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone listening who hasn't encountered the book, we need to explain why that structure is so revolutionary and why she was so frustrated when critics just ignored it.
The structure itself mirrors the fragmentation of the central character, Anna Wolfe. Anna is trying to hold her life together by recording her experiences across 4 distinct color-coded notebooks.
Okay, so what are they?
You have the Black Notebook, which is for her past in Africa, her colonial experience. Then the Red Notebook for her communist political life. The Yellow Notebook is for her emotional and fictional life. She writes a novel within the novel there. And finally, the Blue Notebook is her personal diary, her daily reality.
So these 4 narratives are all fragmented, they're contradictory, they represent the divisions within Anna's own identity.
The political self, the artistic self, the maternal self, the historical self, all separate. And the 5th and final book is the Golden Notebook itself.
Which is where she tries to bring it all together.
That's where she attempts to pull all these fragmented parts together into one unified whole narrative. It's a structural experiment in trying to find coherence amidst chaos.
So by focusing only on the book's critique of gender dynamics, critics, in Lessing's view, were just ignoring the innovative form. They were ignoring the central philosophical question.
Which was, how does one achieve psychological and artistic integrity in a world that demands specialization and separation? She was interested in the unity of the psyche, not just the division between men and women.
Her rejection wasn't just aesthetic, it was profoundly intellectual. We have to revisit that powerful quote she gave about the feminist expectations that were imposed on her.
Oh.
It cuts right to the heart of her skepticism towards any organized movement.
She observed, what the feminists want of me is something they haven't examined because it comes from religion. They want me to bear witness. Do they really want people to make oversimplified statements about men and women? In fact, they do. I've come with great regret to this conclusion.
Wow, that's a fascinating connection she's making there, comparing the fervor of a political movement to religious dogma.
She's essentially saying that feminism, at least in its most rigid form, required faith. It required a commitment to simplified binaries, which she had already rejected in communism. It was just another rigid doctrine demanding an oversimplified narrative.
Her lifelong mission was to resist reduction.
Exactly. She wasn't just interested in the plight of women, she was interested in the plight of the individual consciousness, male or female, under extreme stress.
And there's a small detail in the sources about the inspiration for one of the characters, Molly, being based partly on her friend Joan Rodker.
Right, the daughter of the modernist poet and publisher John Rodker.
Yeah.
And that reinforces this idea. She saw herself in a lineage of literary modernism that prioritized form and psychological depth over mere social commentary.
So we see the transition
Yeah.
from the external political fight against apartheid and colonialism to this internal psychological fight for coherence and truth within her own mind, exemplified by the fragmentation of the Golden Notebook.
But even that was still not enough for her. She needed a larger philosophical umbrella to put it all under.
Yeah.
And that intellectual vacuum, the one created by her disillusionment with all these rigid political structures, it wasn't filled by simple secular philosophy.
No.
It was filled by a deep, sustained engagement with mysticism. And this marked the beginning of her third major phase. The phase often called her Sufi phase, or her embrace of space fiction, starting in the 1970s.
Moving from Marxist political theory to interstellar society is, well, it's arguably the most radical transformation of her entire career. What was the intellectual mechanism that allowed her to make that jump?
The mechanism was her realization that Marxism, because it's fundamentally materialistic, it just ignored the vast importance of spiritual issues, of transformation, of consciousness itself.
So she went looking for a system that didn't ignore them.
And she found it. She became devoted to the Sufi tradition, which is the mystical inner dimension of Islam. It's focused on the search for objective truth and direct personal knowledge of the divine, often through esoteric practices and constant self-observation.
And she didn't come to this alone, did she? The source material identifies her good friend and teacher, Idris Shah.
Yes, who introduced her to Sufism in the mid-1960s, and Shah was an incredibly influential figure in bringing Sufi ideas to the West.
It's a critical point that needs a bit more context. Unlike some Western esoteric traditions, Sufism often emphasizes working within the world, seeing it as a process of accelerated evolution.
It focuses on practical learning, not just abstract meditation, and that must have resonated so strongly with the former political activist in Doris Lessing.
The sources also connect her work to the philosophical approach of G.I. Gurdjieff, specifically his work All and Everything.
Right. For you, the listener, Gurdjieff was a mystical teacher who developed a system known as the Fourth Way, and it aimed at accelerating human evolution by integrating the body, the mind, and the emotional states right in the middle of everyday life.
So the key shared concepts here between Lessing's new framework, Sufism, and Gurdjieff are what?
The idea that humans are essentially asleep, that we're living under illusions, and that true, meaningful change has to come from an inner evolution of consciousness, often guided by external, more evolved forces.
So the external political fixes she had sought in Rhodesia and London were now replaced by this internal mandate to transform oneself.
Exactly, and that transformation became the engine of her third literary phase. The 5 novels published between 1979 and 1983, collectively known as Canopus in Argos archives.
And she saw this as a natural progression, even if the genre changed so drastically.
She did. She explicitly preferred the term space fiction, which was a designation she shared with C.S. Lewis, actually, regarding his own philosophical novels. For her, this was just social fiction elevated to a universal plane.
So the thematic content is dense. It's using these Sufi concepts to explore the efforts of an advanced interstellar society, Canopus,
which is trying to manage and accelerate the evolution of other less developed worlds, including Earth.
Earth is viewed as a sort of chaotic, messy experiment.
A failed experiment in many ways. You can see her lifetime of scrutiny just elevated to a cosmic scale. Instead of Lessing observing the failures of British colonialism, she's now observing the failures of all of Earth's civilization through the eyes of an advanced, benevolent, but often ruthless galactic administrator.
Earlier works, like the dystopian memoirs of a survivor and the psychological deep dive briefing for Descent into Hell, they really laid the groundwork for this, didn't they?
They did. They explored inner reality and societal breakdown on a smaller scale before she went truly cosmic.
But this did not sit well with the mainstream literary establishment.
Not at all. They often viewed genre fiction, especially science fiction, as inherently inferior.
It caused a huge critical debate. John Leonard's 1982 critique of The Making of the Representative for Planet 8 is infamous.
He accused her of propagandizing on behalf of our insignificance in the cosmic razzmatazz. Critics felt she had just abandoned serious literature for what they deemed trivial fantasy.
But Lessing, having already rejected the feminist label, was perfectly ready to defend her new genre choice.
Oh, she was absolutely unrepentant. She challenged the critics' narrow definition of literary merit, stating very clearly what they didn't realize was that in science fiction is some of the best social fiction of our time.
And she backed this up with specific examples.
She did. She cited Greg Bear's novel Blood Music as evidence of high-quality, serious writing within the field.
That defense is so crucial because it's not a concession. It's an assertion that the genre provides the necessary intellectual freedom to address humanity's biggest questions without the constraints of political realism or traditional literary form.
And she put her money where her mouth was, too. She appeared as the writer guest of honor at the 1987 World Science Fiction Convention.
She even blurred the lines further when describing Memoirs of a Survivor, a dystopian novel featuring the collapse of society, calling it an attempt at an autobiography.
Which highlights her view that the inner subjective reality of collapse was just as true, just as real as any factual account.
And this commitment to the canopist material wasn't just restricted to novels. She ensured that these cosmic narratives transcended the literary format.
Right. She wrote 2 opera libretti based on the series, with music by the great Philip Glass, The Making of the Representative for Planet 8 in 1986, and The Marriages Between Zones 3, 4, and 5 in 1997. She was determined to legitimize these ideas across the highest art forms. Lessing's persistent skepticism, her desire to challenge assumptions, it just never waned, even as she became this established grand literary figure.
And this is most powerfully demonstrated by her famous experiment in the 1980s, the creation of her alter ego, Jane Summers.
This wasn't just a fun literary game for her.
No, she adopted the pseudonym for 2 novels, The Diary is a Good Neighbor and If the Old Could, with the explicit, almost scientific purpose of demonstrating the profound difficulty new or unknown authors face in breaking into the publishing world, regardless of the quality of their writing.
She wanted to test a hypothesis. Was literary merit or established celebrity the true engine of the publishing industry?
And the results were pretty conclusive.
Oh, yeah. Both novels were summarily rejected by her regular UK publisher, Jonathan Cate.
Her own publisher didn't recognize her writing.
Didn't recognize it at all. The books were eventually accepted by other publishers, Michael Joseph in the UK and Alfred A. Knopf in the US, but only after really struggling to find a home.
And then she revealed the whole deception in 1984.
And it immediately exposed the inner workings of the literary machine. It showed how dependent critics and editors are on brand recognition, on pre-established sales figures, on the author's past reputation, rather than on the text itself.
It just validates her long-held belief that the institutions surrounding art, whether they're political, critical, or commercial, are often motivated by superficial concerns, not genuine intellectual value.
And when the books were finally re-released under one cover, The Diaries of Jane Summers, the name Doris Lessing had to be explicitly featured on the cover to give them the clout they deserved.
That skepticism, it extended directly to the recognition offered by the very establishment she was born into. Lessing had this extraordinarily complex, almost transactional relationship with the British honors system.
She had some very notable, very public refusals.
In 1977, she declined an OBE, an officer of the Order of the British Empire.
And then, even more pointedly, she declined a DBE, a damehood, in 1992.
And when she was asked why, she specifically said that the honor was linked to a non-existent empire, which is just. It's a clear reference to the colonial structures she had spent her entire life dismantling.
Absolutely. Yet, years later, she did accept an honor. In 1999, she accepted an appointment as a member of the Order of the Companions of Honor. This is the exception that proves the rule, isn't it?
It is, because the Companions of Honor is given for conspicuous national service in arts, science, and public service. It has no ties to the colonial past.
So that distinction shows she wasn't rejecting honor per se. She was just rejecting titles associated with an outdated hierarchical imperial structure. She's willing to accept recognition from the nation, but not from the empire.
Her recognition ultimately spanned the globe, which really underscores the breadth of her impact across all these genres and cultures.
Beyond the Nobel, she won the Somerset Maugham Award way back in 1954 and the David Cohen Prize for a Lifetime's Achievement in British Literature in 2001.
And perhaps the most poignant honor came late in her life, the Order of Mapungubwe, Category 7 Gold, awarded by South Africa in 2008.
Given that she was banned from that country for decades because of her anti-apartheid activism, receiving the nation's highest civilian honor was just this powerful, official acknowledgement that she had been on the right side of history all along.
In her final years, physical ailments slowed her down, but they didn't seem to stop her.
A stroke in the late 1990s prevented her from traveling, but she remained immersed in London's cultural life, attending the theater and the opera. She apparently spent her last years focused on the final phase of human consciousness, death, and whether she would have time to finish her latest book.
She passed away in London in 2013 at the age of 94.
But while her physical presence is gone, her scholarly legacy is incredibly robust. It's supported by things like the Doris Lessing Society and its academic journal, Doris Lessing Studies.
And crucially for us, and for anyone wanting to do their own deep dive, we have the immense physical archive of her life. The sources detail the sheer scope of material that exists for scholars to continue their scrutiny of her scrutiny.
The Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin holds nearly all of her extant manuscripts and typescripts up to 2008. It's 76 huge archival boxes.
76 boxes.
While she reportedly kept few of her very early drafts, the volume of material documenting her middle and late career is just astonishing.
But it's the personal archive, the one held by the University of East Anglia's British Archive for Contemporary Writing, that really provides the material to understand the woman behind all these intellectual choices.
That archive contains decades of professional correspondence, yes, but also 40 years of her intensely personal diaries.
40 years of diaries.
And perhaps most revealingly is something called the Whitehorn Letters, 90 love letters written between 1943 and 1949.
The exact period when she was married to Gottfried Lessing, becoming radicalized and making the decision to leave her first two children.
Exactly. These letters to an RAF serviceman named John Whitehorn, they offer an intimate, unfiltered look into the mind of the person who is making those seismic, life-altering choices.
So when we step back, what does this all mean? When we look back at the three distinct phases of Doris Lessing's life, the political realist, the psychological pioneer, and the cosmic visionary, we see a career defined by relentless intellectual evolution.
Her journey just demonstrates that true depth of knowledge often requires the willingness to discard your foundational beliefs.
Right.
She was constantly questioning and shedding labels, whether they were geographical, like Rhodesian settler, or political, like communist, or genre-based, like feminist writer.
Her work, across all of those phases, it was unified not by a single ideology, but by this intense, fiery scrutiny of civilization and its tendency toward dogma and division.
For you, the learner, Lessing's story is really the perfect case study in intellectual independence. She showed that the most profound insights come from the ability to radically shift your viewpoint.
From the isolated colonial farm to the London activist rally.
From the confines of Marxist doctrine to the Sufi mystics study.
And ultimately from the psychological trauma of the self to the grand observation deck of the cosmos.
And that profound journey leads us to our final provocative thought for you to take away.
Lessing dedicated her career to dismantling political and social structures. She famously rejected honors tied to the non-existent empire.
Yet her most intimate history, her personal diaries and those 90 revealing love letters from her most volatile years in Rhodesia, are now categorized, stabilized, and meticulously preserved by the very academic institutions and nations in Texas and the UK that represent the establishment she spent her life critiquing.
So if Lessing was so intent on proving the system was flawed, what does it tell us that her ultimate lasting legacy is now entirely curated by the very system she sought to dismantle?
Something to mull over.